Have you ever heard it told that out on the frontier, among the dust and wind, some children are born carrying the mark of tragedy, a mark they never chose one foggy morning? Folks found a little girl trembling beside a wooden post, her wide eyes frozen in silent terror. She had no parents left, no home to return to, just the faint rise and fall of her breath against the storm of dust that always seemed harsher than mercy. They called her Hattie a half-Apache child, bearing both white and native blood, and seen as a stain between two worlds that would never reconcile. But before we go any deeper into her story, let me pause a moment to speak to you, especially those who have known loss, or felt loneliness bite deep into the skin. If this tale already stirs something in you, hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, tell us where you're listening from. Whether you sit in a warm house tonight, or in an old wooden chair out on the porch, I promise if you stay with me until the end, this won't be just another Western story, but a journey through loneliness, despair, and the fragile ways we search for light in the dark. Now, back to Hattie. She never chose this beginning. Her father was a white man who once rode with the settlers. Her mother, an Apache woman, swept into the whirlpool of border wars. They loved each other in spite of bullets, in spite of the scorn from both sides. But that love was as brief as a desert rainstorm. A bloody clash took them both, leaving Hattie behind in the ashes and red soil of two peoples who never wished to claim her. At first, her aunt took her in, but there was no love in that house. Greed ruled the woman's heart, and she soon realized that raising a half-breed child meant scandal, whispers, and ruin. Every time she looked at Hattie, she saw not a child, but a threat, a thorn lodged in her life. The townsfolk whispered cruel names behind their hands, and the aunt grew more anxious, suffocated by the sight of the girl. So one late afternoon, with the sun sinking low and mean, the woman bundled up Hattie's few belongings, set her on a rickety wagon, and drove her deep into the red dust valley. There, in the long shadows, stood a lonely cabin belonging to Jeremiah Boone, a once famous cowboy, now a man shunned by all. His name had once thundered across the frontier, but now it carried only fear and curses. They said he had killed a man, that his hands were stained with innocent blood. Whatever the truth, no one dared go near him, and that is where the aunt abandoned Hattie, as if discarding a broken possession. Picture it a 9-year-old girl, hair tangled, eyes the color of burnished copper half-Apache, half-white shaking before a weather-beaten wooden door. Behind it were the heavy footsteps of the man the town called a murderer. She had no choice. Her parents were gone. Her aunt had cast her aside, and the rest of the world had already turned its back. That was more than loneliness. It was the cliff edge of despair, where even hope lies buried in the frontier dust. When the heavy door creaked open, Hattie faced a rugged silhouette. Jeremiah Boone appeared, his eyes deep and shadowed, carrying storms untold. There was no embrace, no welcoming word, only silence, thick and heavy, filling a cabin that had long grown used to emptiness. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, whipping the red dust into swirls. Inside Hattie's chest, a void opened wide, parents lost to war, an aunt who abandoned her, and now fate itself delivering her into the cold hands of a man the world despised. It was the moment a child learns that sometimes there is nowhere left to cling to, and yet, dear friends, it is often from the heaviest darkness that a single spark is struck. The story that follows will show what can grow between two souls, both cast aside, meeting under one lonely roof ruin, or a beginning that one could have foreseen. Jeremiah Boone had never thought he would share his cabin with a child again. His log home built from weathered pine, roof darkened by years of smoke, was long accustomed to silence and the whistle of the wind. And yet now, in that cold, dim room. There was the faint sound of a little girl's breathing. The sight stirred memories he had tried hard to bury, the laughter of children, the shape of a family once his own, and those long nights when he asked why life had cast him down into scorn and exile. To the people of the border country, Jeremiah was a wolf-made man, dangerous, best kept at a distance. They spoke of a killing years ago, a saloon fight that left blood on the floor. Whether it was truth or rumor, the story clung to him like a scar that would never fade. Folks avoided him, left him alone in the red dust valley to carry his shame. But inside that cabin, whenever his eyes settled on Hattie curled up by the fire, something in him softened. Beneath his hard shell, he felt a quiet need to shield her, as though a strong wind might carry her away if he ever let down his guard. He never spoke it, never showed tenderness outright. Instead, Jeremiah Boone kept to small gestures, placing an extra log on the fire when the wind howled, leaving a crust of bread on the table and pretending it had no use to him. To Hattie, her grandfather was all she had left. She, who had known the sharp sting of scornful stares, felt no fear under his roof. She saw him not through the town's suspicious eyes, but through the simple gaze of a child who longed for a protector. In that gaze, Jeremiah was no killer. He was the only family she had in a world that had stripped her bare. Still, he held himself apart. Between them lay an invisible fog, his fear that his tainted name, his bloodied reputation, might settle upon her small shoulders, instead of comfort. He gave her silence. Instead of a hand upon her hair, he stood back, watching quietly from across the room. On certain nights, when Hattie had drifted into sleep, Jeremiah sat in his old wooden chair, staring out the window, where the wind carried long, hollow cries through the canyon. He clenched his jaw, telling himself he must keep his heart hard. Too much softness had no place out here, not for a man already condemned, and not for a child who would need strength to survive. Now and then, Hattie would lift her eyes toward him, curiosity mingled with a fragile hope. Each time, Jeremiah felt a sharp ache twist inside, but he always turned away quickly, his face a mask of sternness. He knew if he let his sorrow spill over, both of them would be left defenseless in a land where pity could get you killed. The townsfolk went on whispering about Jeremiah Boone as though he were an outlaw hiding in plain sight. But for Hattie, he became the one constant shape she could trust when the cold wind swept down the ridge. To her, he wasn't a monster. He was the last fortress against a world that wanted her gone. And though he never gave voice to it, Jeremiah felt the emptiness in his chest shift. Hattie's presence rekindled something buried, not only the weight of old pain, but the faintest reason to keep on living. Yet, as any cowboy weathered by dust and years would do, he kept that mercy hidden behind cold eyes. In silence, he guarded her, his one fragile tie to a world that had already turned its back, after those first uneasy days in Jeremiah Boone's cold, lonely cabin. Hattie began to learn how to live with her grandfather and the harsh land that surrounded them. The little girl who once curled by the fire now grew accustomed to the whistle of the wind, the smell of hay clinging to her clothes, and the sun of the western frontier. So fierce it burned the skin. A heart that had once beaten in despair began to find a new rhythm, slow but steady, as though the very land itself was breathing life back into her. Day after day, Hattie wandered the rocky hillsides, her bare feet toughening, no longer afraid of cactus thorns or mud. To her, the wilderness was no longer an enemy, but a stern teacher, showing her how to survive, how to find joy even in dust and heat. And it was on those hills that she met Pete, a thin, bright-eyed boy who herded goats and had lost his father to the hard country. It didn't take long before Pete and Hattie became inseparable. They roamed the grasslands, chased stray goats, shared crusts of bread hard as stone. and laughed beneath skies that belonged to no one. For Hattie, it was the first time she had felt she belonged not as a half-breed child, not as a burden, but as a friend, a companion in freedom. To Pete, Hattie wasn't the whispered shame the grown folks spoke of. She was simply the girl whose rare smile could light up when she tasted freedom. On many evenings, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, the two children sat atop a rocky bluff, gazing out over the valley glowing red in the fading light. Pete liked to kick stones down into the canyon, just to hear the echo, while Hattie sat quiet, listening to the sound return. What rose in her chest was no longer despair, but a strange new peace, as if the winds had carried her past away, leaving behind a childhood she never dared hope for. From a distance, Jeremiah Boone watched with his cold eyes. He seldom stepped into their play, yet he knew that Pete had given Hattie something precious a chance at a childhood. He never said it aloud, but each time Hattie ran back to the cabin, hair tangled, face dusted, and eyes shining. Jeremiah felt the weight on his chest ease. The child he had once received from greedy hands was now growing, carrying the wild strength of the frontier in her stride. Days with Pete began to chase the silence out of the cabin. Hattie learned to ride the old horse Jeremiah still kept. She learned to play a crude little bone flute Pete gave her, the thin notes carrying across the valley like birds in flight. To Jeremiah, the sound called back memories of his own lost boy, before fate had stripped him bare, and in those moments, he realized Hattie's presence was not just a burden, it was a kind of rebirth for Hattie. Childhood on the frontier was unlike any other. It was harsh, but it was freeing. She had no fine toys, no circle of children her age, but she had freedom. Freedom to breathe the hot wind, to run through fields of cactus, to laugh loud beneath an endless sky. And in that freedom, a broken spirit was slowly being stitched back together, piece by fragile piece. Friends, that is the way the frontier shapes a soul. It does not coddle you, but it gives you strength. It does not comfort you, but it teaches you to stand firm in the storm. And for a little girl once abandoned to despair, it was this hard land that raised her up again, teaching her to love freedom, to love life itself, even when the world beyond had refused her a place. One hot morning at the start of summer, before the sun had climbed high, dust rose along the dirt road leading into the valley. From the porch of his cabin, Jeremiah Boone narrowed his eyes. Nearly a year had passed since Hattie's aunt had abandoned her at his doorstep, and now, here came that rickety wagon again. Stepping down was the very same woman, her dark dress coated with dust, her gaze sharp and cold, as if she carried no guilt in her heart. "Brother," she called softly, her voice half pleading, half demanding. Jeremiah clenched the stem of his pipe and waited. He knew this woman never appeared without some scheme in mind. And sure enough, her words soon revealed it. A wealthy family in town was willing to pay for a companion to their ailing daughter, Clara, a frail young lady bound to a wheelchair. To the aunt, Hattie was nothing more than a chance to turn a profit. At that very hour, Hattie had been out in the fields with Pete. When she returned and saw the figure of her aunt, her heart tightened with dread. The woman who had once cast her aside now stood smiling falsely, hand outstretched. "You're coming back with me," she declared, as if it were already decided. Jeremiah did not answer right away. A storm raged inside him. Part of him wanted to clutch his granddaughter close, the only living soul who had warmed his cold years. Yet he knew who he was in the eyes of the world, a branded man. A killer in rumor, if not in truth. Could he truly give her a place in life? Or would she stand a better chance in a fine home, even if it came through the hands of this greedy woman that night? Jeremiah sat long by the fire. The flames crackled, throwing shadows over his weathered face. He thought of Hattie's shining eyes as she rode his old horse, of the thin notes of her flute drifting across the valley. If he let her go, all of it would vanish, and his cabin would sink back into its deathly silence. Yet if he held on, was it selfishness? Was he clinging to a child who deserved more than the company of a man the world despised? Hattie, having overheard enough, lay awake in her bed that night, eyes wide open, in her memory. Her aunt's face meant only abandonment and coldness, the thought of leaving her grandfather, of leaving Pete, of leaving the land that had taught her freedom, tore at her heart. But she was only a child. Her voice carried little weight in the matters of grown folk. By morning, the aunt pressed harder. Jeremiah stood at the threshold, his expression clouded. He looked down at Hattie and saw her eyes swollen from holding back tears. That look struck him deeper than any bullet he had ever faced. His throat closed. His hand trembled as he laid it on her small shoulder. "Go on." "Hattie," he rasped, his voice rough with pain. "Maybe it'll be better for you." The aunt gave a thin smile and pulled Hattie toward the wagon. From a distance, Pete stood clutching the little bone flute in his hand, too stricken to step closer. Jeremiah remained rooted before the cabin, watching the wagon wheels roll away, carrying off the small figure he had learned to love in silence. And in that moment, the wind swept hard through the valley, lifting red dust into a blinding haze, as if trying to hide the wet shine in the old cowboy's eyes. He knew he had lost again, lost the fragile light that had once helped him endure the darkness of his days. The town was nothing like the red dust valley Hattie had known. Here the streets were paved with stone, lined with houses roofed in bright tile, and every evening the steady clatter of carriages echoed down the lanes. To Hattie, it was a world both dazzling and suffocating, where everything was bound by rules and watchful eyes. Her greedy aunt cared little for her, busy only with counting her pay. And so Hattie was left in the care of the wealthy Sesamon family, where she met Clara. Clara was a frail young lady, skin pale as porcelain, golden hair brushed smooth each morning. She sat in a wooden wheelchair, her legs motionless beneath a thin blanket. At first, a gulf lay between the two girls on one side, a half-Apache child roughened by dust, clothes plain and eyes wary as a wild thing. On the other, a town-bred heiress, accustomed to gentle voices and fine manners. Yet it was that very difference that turned their meeting into the beginning of something new. From the first conversation, Clara was captivated. In Hattie's plain words came the wide-open sunsets of the valley, the goat-chasing adventures with Pete, the thin flute notes drifting across the hills. To Clara, each tale was like a strange wind sweeping into her quiet room, which had known little more than silence and the creak of wheels on wood. Her eyes brightened, flickering with a spark her family had rarely seen. For Hattie, there was hesitation at first. The polished furniture, the lace curtains, the air heavy with refinement, it all felt foreign, stifling. But when she saw Clara lean forward, eyes filled with wonder and admiration, Hattie realized she was no longer just the half-breed child cast aside. She was someone who could bring a new world into another's heart. That realization brought a rare smile to her sun-darkened face. Day after day, the two girls grew close. Hattie told Clara of cactus blossoms that bloomed white on the rocky slopes, of Pete's mischief as he stirred the goats into a noisy scramble. Clara, in turn, showed Hattie the printed words in an old book, guiding her through careful pronunciation. Piece by piece, they traded fragments of their worlds until a bond bloomed simple, innocent, unshaken by the divisions that adults had built around them. Soon, the household began to notice the change in Clara. She laughed more often. Her voice carried a lively rhythm instead of flatness. Through Hattie's half-Apache spirit, wild and unafraid, Clara's fragile heart found new strength. to her. Hattie was not just a companion, but a doorway to a place she had never walked, a world of open skies, where freedom could be breathed in with every gust of wind. Some afternoons, as the sun slanted through the window, the two sat side by side at the table, one speaking of the frontier hills, the other closing her eyes to imagine them. Their voices mingled, a hesitant but earnest storyteller and a listener whose laughter rose light as a bell. In that sound was the beginning of friendship, pure, unguarded, enough to brighten a house long steeped in stillness. For Hattie, the bond was a warm fire, helping her forget for a while the ache of missing her grandfather and Pete, though she lived in a world far removed. She found kinship in her new friend's eyes, and for Clara, Hattie was proof that sometimes a wild wind from the frontier could awaken a heart thought nearly gone. Friends. The friendship of these two girls, one bound to a chair, the other once cast aside at the edge of the frontier, proved that innocence can bridge any divide. It showed that purity has the power to bring together worlds that seemed forever apart. And perhaps, in their shared laughter, both children discovered not just companionship, but a small rebirth of spirit that neither had believed possible. Time in the Sesemann household moved slow. Nothing like the wild days Hattie had known on the dusty plains and rocky hills of the Red Valley. Each morning, when she opened her eyes, the high ceilings and cold brick walls reminded her she was no longer where she belonged. The sky came in chopped squares through lace-curtained windows, not the endless dome she once breathed beneath. In that bright, polished house, Hattie felt like a bird caged in gold, seeing the light, but never free to fly. Clara, innocent as she was, hardly sensed the weight pressing on her friend. She delighted in every story Hattie told, and that only deepened Hattie's unease. She cared for Clara, yet when the nights fell quiet, her heart heard only one call, the whistle of canyon winds, the pounding of hooves on cracked earth, and the deep, watchful eyes of her grandfather. The grown folks in the Sesemann home regarded Hattie with mixed glances. Some nodded, grateful that she had stirred new life in Clara. Others studied her with suspicion, reminding themselves she was still an outsider, a half-breed, an abandoned child now lodged among their fine rooms. Each time Hattie caught those eyes, she felt again like a stranger. The dust of the frontier clinging to her shoulders, no matter how clean her dress, by day. Hattie laughed and spun tales with Clara, but by night, within those four still walls, the longing returned in waves. She missed the burn of hot soil beneath her feet, Pete's mischievous grin as he stirred the goats into chaos, the simple notes of a bone flute drifting with the wind. Above all, she missed the silhouette of Jeremiah Boone, a man the whole valley scorned, yet to her, the only true refuge she had ever known. He had never spoken tender words, never taken her in his arms, but each log he laid on the fire, each small act of care, carried the weight of love. Some nights Hattie pressed her cheek against the cold window glass, staring into the town's lamplit streets. Flickering lanterns could never replace the sweep of stars she had once known. She wished for her worn shoes, for the chance to run through open fields again, to feel the sting of wind against her face while her heart grew light. Here, everything was too neat, too bound, as though the very order of it all was locking her spirit away. Clara sometimes noticed the faraway look in her friend's eyes. "You miss home, don't you?" she asked gently, her voice no stronger than a breeze. Hattie nodded, forcing a smile. She did not want to burden Clara with sorrow, yet she could not deny the ache that gnawed at her chest. The town, with all its comforts, could never fill that emptiness. Friends, perhaps only those who have been torn from their own soil can know that pain. Folks can give you a fine roof and full meals, but nothing replaces the breath of the land that raised you. For Hattie, That land was the harsh but free plains, and her grandfather, the man scorned by the world, was the only home that mattered. And so, in the whisper of the town's midnight stillness, Hattie made a promise to herself one day. She would return. For no matter how bright the lanterns shone here, her heart belonged to the red dust country where an old man waited in silence, and where her true childhood had begun. Life in town might have seemed to close its doors on Hattie, but it was Clara's grandmother, wise from years of hardship, who quietly opened another path. The old woman, with eyes that had seen too much, noticed the longing in Hattie that no comfort could erase. She understood the girl belonged to the open country, to the wind and dust more than to brick and lace. And so, after quiet talks and careful thought, she spoke plainly to her family the child must return to her grandfather. Out there, she can truly be herself. That decision lit Hattie's heart like dawn breaking. On the day she left the town, she held Clara's hand tightly, promising their friendship would not fade. Clara, with tears trembling in her eyes, nodded softly. "One day, I'll come to visit you," she whispered. That promise, fragile yet true, planted a seed of hope in both their hearts. When the wagon rolled over the red dust road once more, Hattie's pulse quickened. And then, across the valley winds, the weathered cabin of Jeremiah Boone came into view, a place both strange and dear. Her grandfather stood at the door, thin frame, eyes still deep and dark. In that moment, all the loneliness, all the aching homesickness of the past months burst free as tears streaming down her cheeks. Jeremiah said nothing as he wrapped his arms around the girl. He was a man who had long hidden his feelings. But now his hands shook, holding her as if letting go would mean losing her again. In the crimson light of evening, the sight of the old cowboy and the child clinging to one another seemed to still the whole sky. Not long after, the Sesemann family kept their word. Clara, her grandmother, and kin set out across the frontier to visit. The town buzzed when a fine carriage rattled into country few dared to tread. And there, in that dust-stained valley, the truth buried for years began to rise. At first, they looked upon Jeremiah with wary eyes. The legend of him, a cold-blooded killer, ran deep in every whisper. But the longer they stayed, the more they saw not a murderer, but a man scarred, carrying a burden he had never deserved. Bit by bit, the story came out years ago. Jeremiah had been framed by a powerful man of the border country, one who had buried his own sins beneath another man's ruin. When the truth pieced itself together, Clara and her grandmother fell silent. In Jeremiah's gaze they saw not cruelty, but the wound of a life lived under false blame. And when the old woman finally nodded, it was as if a weight lifted the first true recognition that Jeremiah Boone had never been guilty at all. For Hattie, it was like witnessing a miracle. Her grandfather was no longer only the lone figure she clung to. In the dark, he was a man restored. His honor seen at last, in the compassion shining from others' eyes. She felt her faith vindicated. She had always known he was her fortress, and now the world was beginning to see it too. Friends, truth may come late, but when it breaks open, it washes clean years of bitterness. That day in the Red Valley, when a family from town reached out to a man once despised, Jeremiah Boone stood upright again, his dignity returned, and for Hattie, held fast in her grandfather's arms. Her longing to come home was no longer just homesickness. It had become the journey of bringing truth back into the light. That day, the frontier carried a strange kind of life in its air. The afternoon sun burned gold. The wind carried the scent of dry grass, and birds cried out from the ridges. Clara sat on the porch of the cabin, her trembling hands clasped in Hattie's. The young heiress, who had known nothing but the prison of a wooden chair, rose slowly to her feet, her legs shaking, yet her eyes shining with resolve. "You can do it," Hattie whispered, her voice firm as the wind across the valley. Step by step, Clara moved forward. Jeremiah Boone and Clara's grandmother looked on wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were seeing. Her bare feet touched the rough earth, the old blanket that once covered her useless legs now forgotten on the chair. Every step was a battle, but every step was also a declaration out here. Beneath this boundless sky, even the impossible could be made real. When Clara faltered, Hattie caught her, holding her steady with eyes lit by courage. "You can keep going. I'm right here," she urged. And Clara rose again, this time a little steadier, her lips curving into a smile tired, but full of joy. Friends, perhaps that is where we truly see the miracle of this life, not in thunder or fire from heaven, but in the simple strength of friendship and faith. A girl once bound to a chair dared to walk, not because of magic, but because someone believed she could. At the same time, word spread through the town Jeremiah Boone was no murderer. The truth had come to light at last, years ago. A powerful man had framed him, burying his own crimes under Jeremiah's name. Now that story, once whispered in fear, shifted. Folks began to look at him with different eyes, no longer as a killer, but as a man who had borne injustice in silence. Jeremiah stood on the old wooden porch, his calloused hands gripping his pipe, his gaze fixed far off. He did not shout, did not celebrate. Yet within him, a weight lifted the burden of shame he had carried for years, sliding off his shoulders. His back, once bowed under scorn, straightened a little, as though dignity itself had been returned to him. Hattie looked at him with pride swelling in her chest. To her, he was no longer just the lone figure she clung to in the dark. He was a man restored, a fortress proven true. In his eyes, she saw a glimmer of something she had never seen before: hope. And so, the story closed that day with 3 figures on the porch, 3 generations bound not by blood alone, but by love and survival. Clara leaned against Hattie, her legs weak but her spirit alive with new faith. Jeremiah sat beside them, silent yet at peace, his gaze fixed on the burning sun sinking into the horizon. And Hattie, caught between them, felt her heart full in a way she had never known. In that moment, all the walls and judgments of the world seemed to melt away. A half-breed child once abandoned, a fragile heiress once chained to her chair, and an old cowboy once branded a killer all sat together, sharing one sunset. It was not just the close of a day, it was the birth of something new. Friends, I must ask you now, do you believe in miracles? Perhaps they are not found in grand displays, but in these small victories that change a life. Clara walked. Jeremiah was vindicated, and Hattie found her home again. These are miracles, plain as the dust under our boots, yet powerful enough to change destinies. If this story has stirred something in you, I ask you to show your support, hit that like button, share your thoughts, and keep these frontier tales alive, because your voice, your encouragement, is what keeps the memory of justice, friendship, and hope burning bright. And let me leave you with a question. What would you say to these characters if you could should Jeremiah open his heart more, so Hattie grows not only under his protection, but also in his love spoken aloud? Should Hattie continue to encourage Clara, helping her step boldly into her new life? And perhaps Clara, with her family's wealth and standing, should use her voice to tear down the very prejudices that once condemned Jeremiah, think on it, and share what you feel. Because this story is not only a piece of frontier memory, it is a reminder that we, too, can bring miracles into being, if we dare to open our hearts. The sun dipped low, painting the valley red. 3 figures sat in silence on the porch, Yet within that silence, a new song began to play, the song of beginnings, of faith reborn, and their story, like the land itself, went on carrying hope toward the unwritten days ahead.